Welcome back. Before we get started, I've got a set of Bible verses for us. It's from Luke 18:1 through 8. Then Jesus told them a parable about their need to pray always, and not to lose heart. He said, in a certain city there was a judge who neither feared God nor had respect for people in that city. In that city there was a widow who kept coming to him and saying, "Grant me justice against my opponent." For a while he refused, but later he said to himself, "Though I have no fear of God and no respect for anyone, yet because this widow keeps bothering me, I will grant her justice so that she may not wear me out by continually coming." And the Lord said, "Listen to what the unjust judge says. And will not God grant justice to his chosen ones who cry to him day and night? Will he delay long in helping them? I will tell you, he will quickly grant justice to them. And yet, when the Son of Man comes, will he find faith on earth?" So that is the parable of the widow and the judge. We are, in many ways, we're supposed to relate to the widow. And there's obviously differences, I think, in everyone's sort of life in that. I know for me personally, I'm not necessarily seeking out justice at every sort of turn in the way that sort of she is. And I mean, obviously, there's also differences with God as well. But there's the point behind it that we shouldn't really take away from that verse and that parable is that if an unjust judge is willing to do justice for a widow just to get her to be quiet, how much more so is God going to do for us when He loves us? And what do you think on that sort of Sarah?
I think kind of the purpose of the story was to say that the reason the judge changed his mind is because the widow was so persistent.
Yes.
Not that he was, I'll just get rid of her. She was so persistent. She was there day and night, in his face, in his courtroom, all the time, asking for justice. Now, sometimes what we're praying for is not for justice. But the widow and us are supposed to be in constant prayer for the things of life. The story about the widow is that perhaps her family had been mistreating her.
Right.
And weren't giving her the legal remedies that she was entitled to. So that's when she came into the story and went to the judge and said, do the right thing, Judge. My family's mistreating me. How many times do we look at something and say, do the right thing, God, this person is doing bad to me? And yet, God always wants good for us. He's not like the judge in the story who'll say, eventually I'll give in. He wants the best for us.
I mean, and I think Jesus is telling the story because that is something that is very hard to realize with prayer. It oftentimes feels like, when you don't get what you're praying for that first time, it's kind of hard to think, well, maybe I should keep pressing. Now, I do always preface this by pointing out that God does have the right to say no to prayers. That is something that I think we do somewhat forget. I mean, if God said no to Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, He's definitely going to say no to us in certain situations. So that is something to keep in mind. But one of the things that I think is very important to kind of take from Jesus' example is even in the cases when God is saying no, you should still continue to pray, because the point of prayer and persisting in prayer at that point is to kind of find oneness with God's plan and to find peace with that. So you never be afraid to consistently pray for things in your life.
And I think the consistency is what Jesus is talking about here. How many times did that woman hear no?
Yeah.
How many times? I used to have a coffee mug that said God answers prayers 3 ways. Yes, no, and you've got to be kidding. So, sometimes we ask for the totally wrong things.
Right.
I mean, dear Lord, I need a big screen TV. Well, that's not exactly what God's going to be able to provide for you in an instant. He's not going to, poof one onto your TV stand. But maybe if you need a big screen TV, maybe what you really need is a TV. Or maybe you don't need that. It's just a want.
Yeah.
And by
I find
consistently
that
praying,
those prayers tend to be the ones that are answered no the most consistently, or you've got to be kidding.
You get the quickest no to those sometimes. But the next segment we're going to talk about is specific prayer.
Yeah.
I find that prayer is the most answered when I am the most specific. So if I hear somebody needs prayer for a child, I'm going to ask for the child's name and what hospital they're in.
Right.
If I can get the name of the doctor, just so I can go to God and say, hey, God, you need to take care of little Bobby down at, our hospital here in Baltimore, Johns Hopkins, because he was in a bike accident and hit his head, and they don't know if he's going to come out of the coma or whatever. So God, please be with Dr. Smith, who is, trying to find a way to relieve some pressure in the brain. The more specific you make the prayer, the more likely you see an answer.
Right.
Now, that doesn't mean I'm praying for a Samsung 75-inch,
I mean, and this goes into our next question about talking about specific prayers. I think, I wouldn't call it necessarily a magic formula, because there is no such thing as a magic formula. God is not a vending machine. But what being specific really shows is that you care about it. And oftentimes, it is true, because I think we can all kind of say, well, if God is all-knowing, he should know what I'm talking about in my prayer. But that's not what it's about. It's about showing that that you care about this, and that you're willing to really put the time in to try and work a God towards that sort of favor. So with that being said, considering your anxieties, do you bring them specifically to God in prayer? If yes, how? If no, how might you do this? So in my case, I do. I typically kind of, I guess you could say, pray on the go. But like when I am going through things, I do go to God, and we have our conversations about it. It's usually somewhat one-sided. But it's still, I'm still going to God about it. That's me, though.
So thinking my anxieties to God, I tend not to do that. I tend to hold on to those. They're my things to deal with. When we've just spent 5 chapters already, and we've got 5 more to go, talking about we take our anxieties to God, the anxieties disappear. So maybe I'm learning something from this. And it took the chapter 6 to get there. But, being specific about your anxieties is kind of scary, because you have to acknowledge them. And for somebody who's avoiding my anxieties, having to sit there and say, oh my gosh, I'm really anxious because it's going to be difficult.
Right.
It causes us to confront some things that we are not comfortable with.
Right.
And just even the process of turning them over to God forces us to look at them and to figure out, this is not me, this is a God thing. It's tough.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it can feel difficult to go in that sort of direction, but it is important.
Oh, it is important.
Which that does lead us into this next question, which is prayer takes discipline and dedication. It takes effort to make the time, and it takes belief to be consistent. If we don't believe that God is hearing us or that he cares, our determination to pray will quickly fade. There's a Bible verse here. Therefore, humble yourselves under the mighty hand of God, that he may exalt you in due time, casting all your care upon him, for he cares for you. And that's 1 Peter 5:6-7. So according to these verses, why should you give your anxieties to God? Is this a good enough reason to put the effort into prayer? So with that, I think the obvious thing is that it's the very last part of that passage. It's God cares for you, so that's why you should give your anxieties to him. And that is a good enough reason to pray and to go to him about that. So with this verse, you'll notice the verse itself does not ask you to forget to set aside your anxieties, and I do think that is important to recognize. It acknowledges that your anxieties are real, but instead of pushing them aside, you are putting them literally on God. It's an idea of like transferring that sort of thing. So how might this imagery guide the way you pray?
Well, since I just said I hold on to all my anxieties, if I have to transfer them to God, I'm going to spend time. I spend time thinking about my anxieties, why I have these anxieties, and really kind of saying, okay, God, you're in control. I have you in control over here. You got this part, but I don't know about these anxieties. And this is where the real trust of prayer comes in, that God is going to say, not to you, oh, that's just stupid. I can't believe you prayed for that. But to sit there and say, I hear you. I acknowledge that this is a problem for you. And let me take care of that for you.
Right.
I mean, letting God take care of our problems is so out of the ordinary for many of us. We want to be in control.
Right.
And when we pray and say, it's all yours, God, it's life-changing.
Right. So this is a chapter that does have a little bit of homework at the end of it. The final part of like what we've been kind of talking about is it's asking you to determine a time each day when you will choose to list your anxieties, physically fold up the list and place it somewhere in a basket drawer, etc. And when you start feeling anxious, remember that you have placed your burdens on God for that day. So I encourage you all to do that. If you want to, in the weeks to come, you can share how that has been affecting you. You can do so on our social media pages where these videos are posted. With that, I'm going to let Sarah close us with our meditation.
Hear these words from the Lord, found in Matthew 11, verses 28 through 30. Come to me, all of you who are weary and carry heavy burdens, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you. Let me teach you, because I am humble and gentle at heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy to bear, and the burden I give you is light.